in addition to Steven Knezovic, who's a colleague of mine up here and working on the flaming, we've had many support from organic farmers around the area who've given their advice over the years, as well as technicians. So they do a lot of the work for us, so I wanted to make sure they got thanked. As Liz said, in Nebraska we have a lot of range of conditions agroecologically. They say it's more varied from the western part of our state to the eastern part of our state in terms of rainfall and some other climate factors. So in terms of managing nutrients, especially release from organic matter, we can't really generalize over the whole state. What I'm going to talk about today is the research we're doing in the northeast corner of Nebraska, where the Haskell Ag Lab is, on that dryland organic farm that we have within our research station. On our ground, it's sloping, maybe 6% to 10%. The fields, as you can see, are kind of long rectangles. Each one is only a few acres in size, from 3 to 5. Makes it a challenge to conduct replicated trials because of the constraints of terraces, but we try to fit them in as best we can. There are two main projects that we're doing up here at the Haskell Ag Lab. One of them is the one I'm going to talk about today, the first one on the screen. We have had this grant with winter wheat, and our part of it here is to help create a cropping system in eastern Nebraska that includes more than just corn and soybeans. And so adding a small grain, preferably a winter small grain, was what our objective was. Winter wheat would be taken off in mid-July, and so there'd be a fairly long period from mid-July until the next spring when a row crop could be planted. So our goal was to try to manage that resource and put something productive in there, hopefully something good for the soil erosion, and then either adding organic matter or nitrogen or both. And so that's kind of the emphasis of where we were going with that. In addition, we've also been working on understanding the nutrient-weed interactions in organic row crop systems, but I won't have time to discuss that this afternoon. So the main thing we want to look at in our winter wheat system is that cover crop establishment, and then how to synchronize nitrogen release for both yield and protein. And Richard Little will talk more about the wheat quality, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. In front of you, you have a fairly complicated schematic of our thinking on this, and I'm going to walk through this so you can understand where our research is coming from. We split it up into two sections, nitrogen timing and the cover crop and its management section. But we're looking at a rotation, and we can start anywhere in this cycle. But if we have a row crop or an alfalfa, we split the two between a crop that would be using the nitrogen up in the soil versus the alfalfa that might be putting some nitrogen back in. We have an opportunity for manure spreading. If we have a diversified smaller farm, they would have livestock of some sort, and they might have an opportunity to spread manure either on the alfalfa before it was tilled in or after corn harvest. We would plant our winter wheat, and then in an effort to use a small amount of nitrogen but maybe influence quality, we chose to apply foliar nitrogen later in the season at jointing time of, I think, where we tried to get it on in the winter wheat. And then we would take the winter wheat off, and then we had another experiment where we would go into wheat stubble with either grass or legume cover crops, depending on whether we were going to end up with a grass-based row crop or a legume base. We wanted to keep kind of a rotation of grass, legumes, and we would be researching both the growth of these cover crops as well as how we were going to kill the cover crop or manage that residue to get into the corn. So it takes a little bit of timing and planning to set up these experiments, because we have to have alfalfa, then a year corn and alfalfa, the winter wheat, and move on to the legumes. So it takes a fair amount of coordination to get that done. What I'm going to talk about is mostly very briefly, I'm not going to spend any time on the cover crop species or how much they produced or any of that. I'm going to just briefly go over what we found and how the termination method. In termination methods, we had the flaming, as you could kind of see in the background. We used some of the earlier prototypes that Dr. Knezovic was working on, and then we had conventional disking and the roller crimper that Liz mentioned. One point that I do want to make is that that period between winter wheat harvest and the fall freeze, the rainfall is very variable in Nebraska. We could have perfect conditions to get the cover crop up and growing, or we could have a 6-week dry period and a very poor stands. And the 2 years that we did the cover crop study, 2009 and 10, we had one of each. The first year was tremendously dry, and we had a better stand of volunteer winter wheat than we did of the cover crops. And then the second year we had a fantastic stand, and this is the good stand that I'm showing you with the hairy vetch in front of you. So that's really critical, whether we get enough residue to make it worth the effort, and that's part of the problem of being on the edge of the corn belt. When you boil everything down to what we did in terms of the termination methods, I have put together the 2 years data, 2009, 2010, and where we disc, which would be the normal termination method, or where we grow cover crops that would winter kill. In this case, we had either buckwheat, Sudan grass, or soybeans, or oats. This would be more of a normal dryland yield for that kind of cropping system. In addition to the benefit of the disking, it also allowed us to plant earlier. So we had reduced yields where we either flamed or used the roller crimper. And part of that problem was, you see here, the reduced populations growing into the cover. And then there was also a weed control factor. So both getting a good population and then consistently getting the weeds killed were the two problems we had. I failed to make a similar slide to this for the soybeans, but the soybean yields were actually a much higher percentage of the disc or winter kill, and we did better trying to manage the grasses before the soybeans. And so on average there was a 36% reduction in the soybean yield for either one of the roller crimper or the flamer kill methods, whereas we had about a 68% reduction here on the corn. As Liz mentioned, we are doing more work on the roller crimper. We think we can make that work more effectively. This experiment was our first effort, so we're not saying that we're done with that part of our investigations. Now to move on to the nitrogen component of our work, you may recall we would either have alfalfa or corn as a previous crop. Then we applied manure. We actually applied manure either in the fall or in the spring, and we applied it at 3 rates, so 0, 20 tons, and 40 tons per acre. In the spring application, it was early in the spring, and it was on established winter wheat. And then we had 3 rates of foliar N, 0, 10, and 20 pounds applied later in the season. And this attempt here was to improve protein more than to improve yield. We did struggle to get OMRI list approved products to do this, and we used different products each year due to the certification issues. an aerial shot of our organic farm. You can see in 2008 where we had planted the corn. We have blocks of corn, and then within each of these blocks we put strips of the manure and then substrips of the foliar in. And this is it in more detail. We repeated the study at a different place on the farm in 2010 and 11, so we have 2 cycles of this experiment. Again, due to time limitations, I'm not going to give a lot of detail. I'm going to go right to the yields and what we found. At the end of the first cycle, one thing we found was that our first attempt at undercutting that alfalfa with the Noble blade was not entirely successful, and we did have a fair amount of alfalfa that did not get killed. It survived and competed for moisture with the winter wheat, and that certainly affected yields following the alfalfa. A side benefit of that was after we took the wheat off, the alfalfa came back, and we didn't measure it, but we probably had about 1.5 tons of alfalfa in September that we could have harvested for use as a forage. Our best treatment was fall applied manure at the 20-ton rate without any of the foliar end, and we had about a 12 bushel increase compared to where we did not have any manure applied at all. We did have this problem that's listed there where we got on the fields a little bit too late in the winter, and there was damage to the wheat with the manure application. So unless you can get on there fairly early and not damage the wheat, that's probably not a good time to apply the manure. We didn't really affect protein at all, and that's because it was fairly high even in our check plots. So where they've had the problem was where protein was much lower than 13%. 2011, we had similar response. We did a better job of killing the alfalfa. We had actually much poorer stands coming out of the winter because we had poor stands coming in. It was very dry, and we actually abandoned one replication because of stand. But the bottom line was that the lower rate of manure on the corn did pretty well compared to nothing. And with the alfalfa, we did get a bump with the 20 tons of manure. In the second year, we were on a site that probably was phosphorus deficient as much as nitrogen deficient, so probably some of the alfalfa response here was to the P, not to the N. So just kind of to review what we found here, went over briefly, was that we did a pretty good job with a corn, manure, winter wheat. We did see no evidence to use any foliar N application. And then the choice here, probably if we're going to go with the roller crimper, and in soybeans would be the way to go with a grass cover crop and follow it down here, as compared to moving this around and ending up with corn. So to finish off, our big desire is to be able to consistently get good cover crop growth, but that's really mediated by rainfall in the August period, and in this part of the state we need to expect that we'd have some failures in some years. We're working on the crimping. We kind of have similar responses where it's easier to kill the grass than the legume, and that's shown up in our work. In terms of influencing the winter wheat, we don't have a real big fertility problem on our soils. They're high native fertility, so we got a marginal increase with the smaller rate of the manure, and found that the spring manure, even though it might have more nitrogen available early, we got more damage from the plant damage than benefit. And we found no reason to go with a foliar N late in the season. So with that, I'd like to hand control over to Richard, who will talk about his work with wheat.